On the 17th of October 1777, a British general walked across a muddy field in upstate New York and handed his sword to an American. Behind him stood nearly 6,000 soldiers, the remains of one of the finest armies in the world, now prisoners of war. They had marched south from Canada, expecting to crush a rebellion. Instead, the rebellion crushed them. That was October 1777. By the following February, France had signed a treaty of alliance with the United States, and the entire war had changed forever. If you had asked anyone in London about the American Rebellion back in early 1777, they would have told you it was almost over. The mood in London was not worried. It was impatient. This thing should have been over already. The plan to end the revolution once and for all came together in the drawing rooms of Whitehall. A powerful British army would march south from Canada. General William Howe would push his troops northward up the Hudson. A smaller third force under Colonel St. Leger would strike east from Lake Ontario, slicing the 13 colonies in two. The man who lobbied hardest for this command was Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne was 54 years old, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, a member of Parliament, and a man who wrote plays in his spare time. His soldiers called him Gentleman Johnny. He traveled with a personal wine cellar, a portable writing desk, multiple changes of uniform, and his mistress, the wife of a commissary officer. Burgoyne genuinely believed that this single campaign would crush the rebellion, win the war, and make him a national hero. Burgoyne sailed for Canada in the spring of 1777 with the confidence of a man who had already written his victory speech. That confidence would prove to be the most expensive miscalculation of the entire war. In June of 1777, Burgoyne assembled his invasion force, roughly 7,800 troops in total. Burgoyne also dragged along a massive artillery train of more than 130 cannons. This was an army built for a victory parade, not a wilderness campaign. On the 6th of July, Burgoyne's forces captured Fort Ticonderoga virtually without firing a shot. The Americans abandoned the fort in the middle of the night, leaving behind hundreds of cannons, tons of supplies, and dinner still sitting on the tables. King George reportedly burst into Queen Charlotte's chambers, shouting that he had beaten all the Americans. Burgoyne's morale hit the ceiling, and that overconfidence was about to cost him everything. Instead of continuing south by water, Burgoyne chose to push his army overland through 23 miles of dense virgin forest, partly on the advice of a local loyalist named Philip Schuyler, who had personal financial interests in a road being built through the area. This decision was a catastrophic mistake. General Philip Schuyler ordered the most aggressive scorched earth campaign of the entire revolution. American work parties felled enormous trees across every road, destroyed every bridge, burned every standing crop, slaughtered or drove off every head of cattle. What should have been a march of 2 or 3 days turned into a crawling nightmare that lasted more than 3 weeks. Burgoyne's troops were hacking through tangled wilderness in the brutal July heat, building 40 bridges and an extensive log causeway over 2 miles of swamp, all while dragging those 130 cannons. A young loyalist woman named Jane McCrea was killed and scalped by Native American warriors allied with the British. Recruitment into the American militia surged. Burgoyne's alliance with Native American war parties, which was supposed to terrorize the frontier into submission, was instead driving thousands of armed volunteers straight into the American camp. What Baum found waiting for him near Bennington was Brigadier General John Stark and roughly 2,000 furious New Hampshire and Vermont militiamen. Stark reportedly pointed at the German position on a hilltop and told his men that there were the redcoats and they would be theirs by nightfall, or Molly Stark would sleep a widow. By the time the sun set, Burgoyne had lost nearly 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. 1/8 of his entire army vanished in a single afternoon. He had gained nothing, not a single horse, not a head of cattle, not a wagon of supplies. General William Howe, the man who was supposed to push north from New York City and link up with Burgoyne at Albany, had decided to load his army onto ships and sail south to capture Philadelphia instead. His decision left Burgoyne completely alone. A prudent general would have retreated to Ticonderoga and waited for new orders. Burgoyne was not a prudent general. He pushed forward across the Hudson River, cutting his own line of retreat behind him. South of him, blocking the road to Albany, the entire American Northern Army was dug in on a commanding position called Bemis Heights. Gates now commanded between 12,000 and 15,000 troops. Burgoyne had fewer than 6,000 effectives. He was outnumbered more than 2 to 1, and he was about to attack anyway. What he encountered instead was Benedict Arnold. Arnold was at that point the most aggressive and tactically gifted field commander in the Continental Army. He was also impossible to work with, vain, prickly about rank, and locked in a poisonous feud with Gates over credit and authority. The battle that erupted at Freeman's Farm was some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. For nearly 4 hours, the two sides hammered each other across that clearing. By nightfall, the British technically held the field, but they had suffered nearly 600 casualties. It was the kind of victory that destroys an army. Then came 18 days of agony. Burgoyne dug in and waited. Every single day, it got worse. Burgoyne's soldiers were on half rations, then less. The horses were eating bark. Burgoyne still drank his champagne at dinner. He had no plan. Arnold had been formally relieved of his command after a furious shouting match with Gates. Arnold had spent the previous 18 days in bitter fury, pacing his tent and drinking. Now, against direct orders and possibly drunk, he galloped into the fight like a man who no longer cared whether he lived or died. He rode between the lines, rallying American units, directing attacks, physically leading charges. He was everywhere at once, a screaming, reckless, magnetic force that pulled the entire American assault forward. He led a direct assault against the fortified German position known as the Bremen Redoubt. Arnold's horse was shot from under him, and the falling animal crushed his left leg, shattering the same bone he had broken at the Battle of Quebec in 1775. If that musket ball had hit him 2 feet higher and killed him, Benedict Arnold would be remembered today as one of the greatest heroes the American Revolution ever produced. Instead, his story would take a very different turn. In 1780, he attempted to hand the fortress at West Point over to the British for £20,000. Arnold fled to British lines, became the most infamous traitor in American history. On the 17th of October 1777, General John Burgoyne formally surrendered his army to Major General Horatio Gates. 5,791 soldiers laid down their arms that afternoon. It was the largest surrender of British troops on a foreign battlefield in living memory. Saratoga changed the calculation overnight. On the 6th of February 1778, France signed 2 treaties with the United States. French gold filled American war chests. French warships challenged British naval dominance. Spain and the Netherlands entered the conflict as well. None of that happens without Saratoga. Burgoyne returned to England on parole in 1778 and spent the rest of his life explaining what went wrong. He never received another command. He drifted back to the theater and died in 1792, remembered not for his wit or his plays, but for losing an entire army in the woods of New York. At Saratoga, there is a monument to his heroism. It depicts a boot representing his wounded leg. It bears no name. Burgoyne once wrote that he expected to return from America crowned in triumph. He returned in disgrace. The empire he served lost its richest colonies, and the nation he tried to strangle in its infancy went on to outlive that empire entirely.